welcome everyone. We're just letting everyone into the webinar. And we'll make a start when the numbers settle down. Okay, so the numbers seem to have settled, so we'll make a start. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. So my name is Jason Reeves. I'm CIEEM's Head of Policy and Comms. I'll be hosting today's webinar. So this is the 6th episode of our Sector Streams webinar series. Today's topic is invasive species and biosecurity. Sector Streams as a webinar series, we started at the beginning of the pandemic last year, and we had a few episodes all related to something or other in relation to the pandemic and its influence and impact on the ecology and environmental management sector. We've brought it back now as a monthly topical webinar series, and we'll pick something new every month to discuss. So out of interest, next month will be environmental net gain, if that's of interest, but I'll give you some more information about that later. So previous episodes, if you are interested, are on our YouTube channel and in the resource hub on the CIEEM website. And we're recording today as well, and that will be added to those channels as well. So today's episode is on invasives and biosecurity. It's a follow-on in many ways from June's In Practice magazine edition, which was on the same topic. And we have a panel discussion for you today, and then we'll also take questions from the audience. So feel free to use the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of your screen to add any questions. If they're pertinent, we'll add them into the discussion. Otherwise, we'll come to them towards the end of the discussion. But now I'll introduce the panel to you. So today on the panel, we have Alison Dunn, Tom Grayling, Jean Hamilton, and Max Wade. I'll ask them each to just introduce themselves very quickly to you. If we start with Alison.
Hello, thanks very much for inviting me. I work at the University of Leeds. My research is on both the impact of invasive non-native species, and I'm particularly interested in developing and testing effective, cost-effective biosecurity that we can use out in the real world. And today I'm here as part of the Integrated Catchment Management Programme at Leeds University, which is NERC funded, and we're working with the Environment Agency, Wildlife Trust, Yorkshire Water, the Rivers Network, and 2 local authorities, Leeds and Barnsley, to look at biosecurity across local authority land, and that's what we'll be talking about today. Thanks very much.
Tom.
Yeah, hi everybody. Yes, I'm Tom Grayling. I'm Technical Director for 5 Rivers, overseeing the monitoring department. So we're a consultancy that offers river restoration, enhancement, and surface water monitoring. So we're heavily involved in travelling around the country, going from site to site, collecting data or practical contracting works. A background in the public sector, undertaking routine environmental monitoring in surface waters. So yeah, just been heavily involved in data collection for about 15 years.
Thanks very much. Jean.
Hi, I'm Jean Hamilton. I'm an ecological consultant based in County Cork in Ireland. I work for a company called Feely Timony. I'm actually here in more of a capacity with my role with the Action 2030 Working Group, CIEEM's Action 2030 Working Group, which is looking at climate change and the biodiversity crisis. And it's just something that I've brought up recently in the group, but I think there's a bit of interest in it, is how our ecosystems are going to respond to future climate change scenarios, and whether we need to be kind of thinking about incorporating, in non-native species, or, looking at them in a more positive light, in terms of climate change adaptation. So I'm currently writing a blog about it, and will be, I think, putting out a survey to gauge a bit of interest in the wider CIEEM membership to see if there's any interest in and any thoughts on this. So I guess I'm here in a kind of a devil's advocate sort of a role.
That's great. We'll get into that a bit later as well. Thanks. Max.
Thank you, Jason. Max Wade. I'm an ecologist working for AECOM in a team which focuses on invasive non-native plants and animals. And our work ranges from providing a sort of biosecurity strategy, for example, for a large water company, through dealing with Japanese knotweed in a business park or somebody's back garden, through to delivering training. We're involved in a national program offering certification for invasive weed specialists. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you very much, Max. So that's the panel for today. I've asked them each to give a very quick 2-minute overview of what they think some of the biggest issues are. And then we will jump into some questions. So if we go in the same order, Alison, would you like to start?
Thank you. We've been working with local authorities, looking at opportunities for biosecurity, opportunities to develop the good biosecurity practices. And we did this through a series of workshops, interviews, and also some modelling of GIS modelling of in-spread. So we had 3 big aims, one of which was to have a look and see what are our key pathways of spread across local authority land in Yorkshire. What are the challenges and opportunities facing the local authorities, and how can we use these bits of information to help develop recommendations for targeted biosecurity, cost-effective biosecurity. So in our article, we talk about our work on pathways of spread. So that's the ways in which invasive species are spread around. What we did is we took INS mapper data from surveys that are conducted by land managers such as the Environment Agency, the Wildlife Trust, so it's all verified data. And we looked at 3 target species: Japanese knotweed, Himalayan balsam, and giant hogweed, and that's because the local authorities said these were their biggest challenge. We had a look at the geographical location, what factors tend to contribute to where these things were located, and also what kind of factors might be driving their spread over time. And the first thing we found was that quite clearly the patterns of spread were not natural. I mean, for example, we had a look at Japanese knotweed, and over a sort of about 5-year period, it was spreading quite clearly upstream. And so although there is some natural spread of INS, human activities were important. And the other big headline figure was a massive increase, a 700% increase over about 5 years in sightings of these 3 species. So a massive, spread within the local area. And then we had a look using our GIS modelling to ask what are the main drivers of the spread of these. So we used GIS modelling to have a look at both their location and their spread over time. And we found that the key things determining whether these 3 species were present, the 2 big things seem to be development and construction and recreational and amenity use. So construction development was really important for the presence of all 3 species. If there'd been recent construction work and development, or indeed ongoing development on a site already built up, then there was a much greater likelihood of these invasive species being present. And the other factor, of course, was amenity use, so the presence of footpaths and recreational activities, for example, angling, but I just put that one out there. I'm not targeting anglers in particular there. And so it's clear that human activities are contributing to these spread, and we can use that to try and target biosecurity. So if we've got a limited budget, let's target our biosecurity around this construction and around these recreational activities. The second thing we did was to interview key people across local authorities and also other land managers, etc., and ask them about their issues around invasive species. And the message we kept getting was that this is an issue that's across different land managers, across catchments, and across even departments. One of the problems was a lack of a designated budget and a designated person with the authority to do things about this. And as a result, local authorities said that their responses to invasive species tended to be reactive, spiralling annual costs to treat existing infestations with not much attention spent on precautionary approaches to biosecurity. So we all know that that is going to mean that potentially that problem could spiral as these initial infestations then have secondary spread. And interviewees themselves said, we know that biosecurity is really important, but how do we get support? How do we do a cost analysis here to convince people to dedicate budget to biosecurity? Because it's sort of an invisible thing. It's costing us in terms of time, as was discussed in this magazine, and it's costing us in terms of resources. How do we get that budget there? And so our recommendations from the analysis of pathways and our interviews with the local authorities was that clearly we do need a designated budget across local authorities towards biosecurity and not just towards reaction to infestations. And that could be underpinned by cost assessments to try and demonstrate the spiraling costs of infestations and the benefits of biosecurity. The other recommendation is the importance of coordinated biosecurity between and within organisations and along catchments. And we now know that focusing that around construction and around recreation is going to be very beneficial, because we know that these are key pathways of spread. And finally, we recommend embedding biosecurity in key activities across the local authorities. For example, in construction, we can target that towards tendering processes and towards contractors, etc. And we also try and raise public awareness. And those were our 3 recommendations. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alison. Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Yeah, so I think for me, or from my perspective as a consultant and contractors, there's a need for people to visit sites. There's a need for data to inform water resource management and various environmental management activities. But in principle, for me, the activity of biosecurity to prevent the spread, it sounds sometimes quite simple on paper. Check, clean, disinfect, and dry can sound quite simple, but in practice, the actual practical application can be far more complex than you might think. So, it requires knowledge, it requires planning, and it requires a correct allocation of time and resources to ensure you get it right. And all of these elements, to best practice and reducing the risk and protecting the environment and our ecosystems it comes at a cost. And some of these can be more obvious than some. There's the obvious environmental and ecosystem impact, but there can also be potential financial implications to that can indirect impacts on the economy, which are all need some consideration. But for biosecurity to complete biosecurity to a standard that we can have confidence in, you need people and their time. Number one element is time. Be it an employee on a salary, a volunteer for a Rivers Trust, or students undertaking theses and PhDs. But they need to be either knowledgeable, they need to be suitably trained, they need to be educated. That's your first step, is the people and the time. But then become the next items, which can have significant financial implications for organisations, for charities, for universities. And that is, you need a place to undertake this work, to undertake these activities. You need access to a suitable yard and hard standing, water supply. Responsible drainage is a topic that is rarely talked about. Where's our wastewater going? Is it going to surface water? Potentially taking organisms and propagules from invasive plants and spreading them further. So it's quite a complex element, quite a complex task, and then feeding into that as well, you have consultancies and contractors that don't work locally and do have to travel and potentially don't have access to these facilities all the time. And it's very clear that if done poorly, with an inadequate time for planning, resources, time, facilities, there's potential for significant environmental and ecological implications. So yeah, and just to sort of touch base on those costs again, there's an upfront investment that's required by many in terms of training and education, for equipment, for space, for spare survey equipment to make sure that you've got adequate turnaround and drying time of equipment, and the facilities for wastewater management and also the drying. Drying is a challenge in its own right. Ideally, you would dry in crispy, hot summer days like we had last week, but they're few and far between. So you need adequate facilities to allow us to dry equipment and guarantee that the organisms and pathogens are removed before moving on to the next location. And as I think we all know as professional environmental practitioners, the consequences are severe with further degradation of our ecosystems, impacting on ecosystem services, which in turn impact on the price of goods and services and our economy on a wider scale. Yeah, that's me. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Tom. Just a reminder to everyone, if you have any questions, pop them in the Q&A function, and we'll move on to Jean.
Hi, yeah, I suppose I kind of already touched on it in my introduction there, but yeah, I suppose my main sort of view is looking at, in future climate change scenarios, we are, inevitably going to see there's going to be some shifts in species distributions, and there's certain species going to be better adapted, and some of those will be, species that are not native. I guess I've got a bit of background in paleoecology. In my undergrad, I did a study of the 8.2 Ka event, it's climatic oscillation in the early Holocene, and you see this like expansion in birch and in Scots pine as a result of a cold event over the period of about 100 years, and these responses I think we can expect to a certain extent. So I think it's just something that I think it would be good to open up a bit of discussion about it, and whether in some cases a certain amount of acceptance might be required on our part. And even though it's quite painful topic really to discuss, it is something that I think we need to be looking at, and not sort of sticking our heads in the sand. And just from reading some of the articles in the latest In Practice magazine, you just see the extent of the work that's required to control these species. And it's just especially when it comes to invertebrates like the harlequin ladybird and stuff, it's just not feasible really to control some of these species. So I suppose just to open a bit of a discussion about it, and I think also that maybe there's like a certain cultural considerations to take into account, or sociological considerations, because I think particularly with some control of, for example, wild boar, I think there's been a lot of negative response from the general public to the control of these species, and maybe we need to be considering that in what we're doing. And I think it's something that should be discussed a bit more, in the same way that Julia Baker is doing a lot of work on the biodiversity net gain for people's well-being, and taking people's feelings and opinions into account. And maybe we should be doing that a little bit more with invasive species as well. So yeah, that's kind of my opinion. Definitely not saying that invasive species aren't bad for native flora and fauna, but I guess it's just maybe having a bit of an open mind about some of the things. And yeah, so that's about it.
That's great. Thanks, Jean. I'm really interested in us getting back into that topic at some point, but let's move on to Max. Oh, you're still on mute, Max. Yep.
Jason. So I was really keen to have a look at the sort of key resources in terms of human resources, in terms of dealing with the risks posed by invasive non-native species. And I divided them up into 5. The first one are naturalists, botanists, entomologists, mainly largely highly skilled amateurs who create the databases that we use for invasive non-native species distribution. So a vital role, obviously contributed to by others, but mainly highly skilled amateurs. And then volunteers. Volunteers working mainly through local action groups up and down the country. If you had a look at the recent review of the GB strategy for invasive non-native species, there were a number of questions around volunteer input and how to better coordinate it, better use it, etc. But it's a significant resource in terms of the way government sees us dealing with, and in fact actually dealing with, invasive non-native species. Then there are the specialist invasive species contractors, trained, certificated to deal with invasive species. So sort of professional control, that's weeds and insects and other species, mammals, etc. And then there's the consultant ecologists, encountering invasive species in the course of their work, for example, through preliminary ecological appraisals, identifying species and responding accordingly. And then lastly, I thought there were the national agencies such as Environment Agency, Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, and probably foremost in a way, the Great Britain Non-Native Species Secretariat. So all of these resources are really key, and I focused on the role of consultant ecologists and what sort of a job do we need to be doing, and we need to be able to confidently record all the ends as part of our work. Invasive species are part of our work, plants and animals. I think we're probably better at doing the plants than the animals. And all of the surveyors should be competent in identifying these species. We should be able to undertake risk assessment of species encountered, rather than just having a knee-jerk reaction. Anything on Schedule 9 needs to be blasted. But we should also be aware more widely of what local action groups, volunteer groups are trying to achieve, for example, within a river catchment, along a section of river, within a particular part of a local authority area. The consultant should be recommending the production of an invasive species management plan, and where appropriate, to engage with invasive species contractors, properly certificated members of trade associations, to implement their invasive species management plan on behalf of their clients. And then, really importantly, building in monitoring in relation to the projects that are undertaken, so we can go back and check and make sure that the actions were successful, or if not, have built in ways in which to carry on with the control. Lastly, sort of a comment. I think I'm often disappointed in terms of sort of thinking of consultants misidentifying hemlock as giant hogweed, not surveying a stream for species such as signal crayfish, not checking trees in areas of parts of London which could well have a recessionary moth. So work in progress, and I'd be interested in how can we have a better integrated, how can we take an initiative to integrate better these resources, because as the others on the panel have indicated, there's an awful lot of work to do, and we need to be more efficient and more joined up. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks very much, Max. If we jump into a few questions, then there's a couple that have popped up on the in the Q&A, both related to Jean's comments. So let's leave them for a second. Just come back to Alison. So one of the things that came up in your introduction and in your article in Practice was around budgets and local authorities and them being stretched. How do we convince local authorities that this is something that they need to allocate budget to, that, or almost ring fence budget to?
I think it's a real challenge, because the success of biosecurity is that something hasn't happened. So that's quite a difficult one to demonstrate. I think one of the things is that there's a lot of different departments within a local authority ending up paying for ongoing treatment, and sometimes that's hidden and isn't compared. And if we look at those ongoing budgets, and perhaps the fact that sometimes even with ongoing control there might be secondary spread, we can try and demonstrate that the need to try and prevent further spread. So I think looking at the costs of ongoing treatment is just as important, because the cost of biosecurity, as Tom alluded to, is partly a hard financial figure, but it's partly to do with embedding stuff into processes and you know, time costs and so on. And the other thing with the local authorities, of course, is that which they may bear the cost, for example, of having to control something once there's an infestation, some of the biosecurity is stuff that people working on their land need to do. So a lot of stuff is contracted out, people come in and do works, etc. And so that's an important point where they can try and talk to their contractors and try and develop good biosecurity policies if people are going to come and work on the land, much in the way that some of the other companies, other people such as the Environment Agency already do.
Thanks very much. Tom, you talked a lot about costs and time. Did you want to add anything to that one in particular?
Yeah, yeah. I think from and I think Max made a really good point that the consultants have got a lot to, there's a lot on our shoulders. We travel the country. We do go to lots of places. And I really, for us, it's very much about looking at ways to work with, say, local authorities, or work with the supply chain that we're within, to really share those costs and find ways to make sure that we're working together in a joined up and aligned way, so that it doesn't just kind of, the costs sort of fall downhill to the contractor who's got their boots getting very muddy on the ground. And so for me, it's just about increasing awareness and having more conversations around how we can be transparent and share that cost, because there's real potential for the bottom line, the price, to decide who does what work, who goes where. Things such as maybe potentially more weighted tender evaluation for local contractors, built into policy. Things like that would be really fantastic, because we see opportunities in our local catchments that we don't get to work on, and we try our hardest. We should be the cheapest, but potentially some of the associated costs of high levels of biosecurity can put you in a disadvantaged position over someone who's one small scale operator. But yeah, so for me, it's just about opening that conversation for how we can share it and make sure the wider risk to the environment is at the priority, and not the actual cost.
Thanks. Jean or Max, would you like to add anything to that one?
One of the approaches that sort of working with a couple of local authorities that we found quite useful was to help them to see it not as something, I think as Alison was really pointing out, as something sort of separate. It's integral across the local authority, and they need to deal with it collectively. So it's rather like health and safety or well-being. And everybody has a responsibility. There should be a strategy, and everybody should know about it, and it just becomes part of what you do on a day-to-day basis. So, and then you sort of help each other. So, for instance, where the police were working with the sort of estate management to deal with Japanese knotweed, they were happy to fund the removal. Because the Japanese knotweed was contributing to sort of shady, rather unsalubrious environment. So quite a good example of bedfellows you wouldn't have thought of working together. So within local authorities, there's quite a lot you can achieve, I think, by being a bit imaginative, but we need to help local authorities sort of share their experience and our experiences as well.
Thanks, Max. Jean, did you want to add anything to that one?
Yeah, I'd agree with Max's comment there about, comparing it to health and safety. We took that approach. I worked on a project with Clare County Council developing a biodiversity management system, and we kind of made that point that in the same way that you would have like a risk assessment, for health and safety, that you would have a biodiversity or risk assessment to include for biosecurity, and just make sure that it's embedded into all work practices. And yeah, I suppose just prevention is better than cure. So just making sure everybody knows how to identify these species and catch them early to reduce the costs of control at a later stage. So.
We've had a comment in, an anonymous comment around how can the general public be persuaded, convinced, incentivized to carry out biosecurity measures? Is there likely to be a realistic way of managing the risk of spread? Is that something that we could link to the health and safety element of it? Is that the way to go with this, rather than trying to explain the complexities of ecosystems? Would anyone like to jump in on that?
I think one of the good examples that people use is there are examples, for example, where people have lost access to amenities, for example, having to close down whole angling sites, etc., if there's an outbreak of a disease or something. So there might be some examples there of a direct way this can affect you, and that can perhaps be a driver, as well as trying to explain the importance of biodiversity, etc.
Yeah, I'd agree with that as well, Alison. There's, you provided examples of how these things can impact everybody. So obviously, I'd say everyone in this room is probably passionate about habitats and species, but not everybody is. Different people are driven by different things. I think it's raising awareness around, water supply, where that comes from, the management and the assessment of pathways for water transfer within the water industry, and how that impacts water bills. And some people are driven by the cost of living for their own home. So while some people are driven by the environment, some people are not. I think there's other ways to provide examples for how biosecurity is impacting our daily lives.
And I think another thing that's really important is, as it becomes more standardized, so people become more accepting of it. So if you think of the change in recycling practices over many years, it's much more normal now. And so I can imagine it would be embarrassing to not recycle your plastic cup when you see everybody else is doing it. So once we start to encourage people and there's more uptake, people might be more responsive to that social norm and see what other people are doing.
I think one of the things, Alison, that comes out of that, if you sort of extend it, is in a way that people then would start paying for getting rid of these plants. So and it may link into, Jean, what you were talking about, where we have a species that arrives in the UK or Ireland, and we decide we need to do something about it. If the general public understands the importance of that, then the sort of local authority can issue a notice saying, please would you get rid of the buddleia in your garden. It's been listed as we don't want this species in approach, rather than then having to suffer the consequences of the species. I've sort of chosen buddleia as a sort of rather extreme example, but nevertheless, there's a hell of a lot of work that needs doing, and if the public were prepared to do that, then it would cost an awful lot less. And an experience I had in a suburb of Sydney with a noxious weed officer, he was going around issuing privet notices to gardens that have privet in. Privet is a real problem in the bush on the edges of habitats in around Sydney. And I said, are people really going to do this? Yeah, of course they're going to do it. They understand, and that's I think where we need to get to.
For some things, they may also be a reputational driver. So there are examples of people that have had something spread from their land and ended up with a reputational cost, or somebody's been burnt by giant hogweed, or somebody's allowed Japanese knotweed to spread and had to get rid of it. So there might be, once you get to looking at slightly beyond the public to more, you know, individuals owning land, there might be that reputational thing as well.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Potential costs.
Yeah, and well, it's just something to, I suppose, that we should be sensitive of as well, because like I've worked on a project in the Bride catchment in Cork, and there is a, you know, and we haven't actually implemented a strategy yet, but we've mapped the giant hogweed throughout the catchment, and you know, met a few landowners while we were doing that mapping work. And there's a certain amount of, like, you know, some people are actually already doing a lot of work to try and control the hogweed, but if you have just one landowner along the whole, you know, watercourse who's not doing it, then, you know, it's not going to work. And I, you know, did pick up on a bit of resentment among certain landowners, you know, saying, you know, that their neighbour isn't doing it, and you know, it does require a coordinated approach, and that's, I think, the key thing, is getting everybody to work together, which is the biggest challenge, I think, really. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Let's move on. Tom, you've sort of touched on skills, and I'm wondering if there's bigger issues around skills in the ecology sector. Is this one where there are also gaps in terms of invasive species understanding for ecologists themselves?
Yeah, I definitely would say there is. I'd say there's very good awareness, understanding around the large item, the large plants, you know, your giant hogweed, your Himalayan balsam, your knotweed. I think there's really, really good understanding on that. What I think can sometimes be forgotten, or not by all, but certainly the waterborne pathogens, you know, your crayfish plague, or the various fish diseases, which can have significant impacts on our wild fish populations. And can be moved, and they can't be seen with the naked eye. So I think there's a real gap in that, the aquatic knowledge at times, and a lot of focus on the big things we can see and avoid, and yeah. But I think there's always a challenge, because you know, there's always new people coming into the industry and getting awareness and that real holistic understanding of the subject, and the intricacies of what you know, you can cause a negative effect by doing something that potentially you see as a positive thing. You may be going back to your yard, washing your equipment, and then sending things downstream, because there's a gap in that knowledge in terms of how surface water works, how land drainage, and the connections and the pathways, as Alison's pointed out. So I think it's just it's an ongoing challenge. But I would say that I've seen in my own like career in early time, I've definitely seen an increase. I've seen a lot of awareness and an increase. But I think, you know, it's something you can't take your foot off the pedal, so to speak. And yeah, more sharing, more knowledge sharing, more conversations are always needed, and maybe more of a formal structure to training and minimum requirements expected from the likes of, you know, consultants and everybody involved in you know, environmental management protection.
Would anyone else like to add to that one?
Certainly pick up on what you were saying, Tom, about the need to take freshwater habitats sort of more seriously, or put more effort in. The examples you gave of the plants, you know, they're pretty big things, and you're unlikely to miss them once they've got going. But for the aquatic environment, you're going to have to actually make an effort and take samples and look at in more detail. I think that leads me on to sort of an observation that for protected species, for example, something like badgers or waterfowl, what we tend to do in terms of the sort of ecological appraisal is undertake an initial assessment of the site. And okay, yeah, that looks as though, yeah, that could be really good waterfowl habitat. I'm not a waterfowl specialist myself, so, you know, I think I'll recommend, I need to recommend that we do a waterfowl survey. And I think that should really apply as well to invasive non-native species. that in certain instances, there could be a muntjac problem in a woodland, there could be signal crayfish, there could be a processionary moth, and it could be a range of species, which it's unreasonable to expect on a preliminary ecological appraisal that an ecologist will pick this up. What we need are ecologists who recognise the habitat, recognise the geography, and then make a recommendation that we should sort of follow up. So I think that will be something that I would encourage.
Yeah, and that desktop, biological records as well, and understanding the catchment for me. There's a lot more that can be done there in terms of actually fully understanding what to expect and what's normal. Not what's normal, but the new norm, so to speak, and applying, I guess, measures that are reasonable for that level of what you're going to experience. But yeah, I think often the what's below the surface gets forgotten as well from that, can be from the DESPO study, and isn't always forthcoming when it comes to the contractor to tender for that work. It's not always available, and it's actually knowledge. Industry is often knowledge that is specialist knowledge that kind of informs. Oh well, we know signal crayfish are present in that catchment, or virile crayfish, or or the known populations of white claws. But yeah, it takes a real informed position to actually make those decisions. It's hard to do from visiting a site and assessing the habitat in a preliminary assessment.
Great, thanks. Time's ticking on, so let's move on. Jean, there's been lots of comments around climate change and where we go with that. So there's a couple here. I agree that people's opinions and thoughts should be considered when managing invasive species, but it can't be driven by this because opinions often change with education. So where does education fit in that? What are the panel's takes on sociological factors when considering, for example, grey squirrel? So that's an interesting one I'd like to pick up on as well, where we have this one issue around nature connectedness, and I see people in London really enjoying grey squirrels, and then the other aspect of them being invasives and the impacts on greys and others. And they're mentioned here around reintroduction of pine martens and how that could be one way to approach it in a different way. And then, okay, so there's a general comment around resilience and ecosystems. But yeah, so non-natives, climate change, where are we going? Could they be part of the system? Jean, do you want to say something first? And then we'll open it up to the rest of the panel.
Yeah, thanks. And that was a good question about the, considering people's opinions and how, education, I think, is vital, and just telling, informing public of what we're doing and why we're doing it. But I do think that we also should, take the public's, considerations into account in the decision-making process to a certain extent. And I guess what we've got in Ireland is the what's going to be coming up soon. Hopefully, it's in the programme for government, is having a citizens' assembly on biodiversity. I don't know if you know much about the citizens' assembly in Ireland, but it's informed a couple of the recent referenda on marriage equality and abortion, and was also like I think it went towards informing the recent climate bill. And so it's a really good kind of mechanism for involving the public, or a group of our peers in the decision-making process, and considering this sort of as that we don't have all the right answers, and that there should be maybe some a debate about it. So I would hope that that this is considered in that upcoming citizens' assembly. But yeah, I suppose I just do think that because of what we're facing in terms of climate change, I don't think any of us really could claim to be experts, because it's so we're just really entering sort of uncharted territory. So I think it is just important to just keep an open mind about things, and definitely involving the public. Yeah.
Does anyone else on the panel want to jump in on that one?
Just going back to what I was talking about, sort of resources. In terms of the climate change and new species arriving, I think we've got a very good alert system. The botanists, entomologists and so on, really on the whole are on top of and can describe the first occurrences of these species in the wild. Where I think we need to improve is in terms of the rapid response as it's described. So yes, we've got the first occurrence of giant hogweed in our local authority area or something like that, and we'll undertake a rapid response. A lot of this, I think, in our experience, is a lack of forethought and planning. So in terms of implementing a rapid response, who's going to make a decision in the local authority or in any organisation? It could be a power company, it could be a water company. Who takes the decision that we're going to take action to deal with it? Because we know as a result of climate change, it's going to spread and become more of a problem. And not only that, have you got a contractor on your procurement list who's ticked all your boxes that you can actually use? And as I say, we've experienced instances where, having spotted the invasive species and recommended a rapid response, due to poor planning, administration requirements, etc., it's been 6 to 8 months before the contract been let. The plant is now seeded and it produces, 100,000 seeds, and you're sort of tearing your hair out in terms of, well, where was the rapid in that response? So I think we can respond to the sort of situations that Jean's talking about, but unfortunately, we again, awareness and knowing how to respond more from an organisational point of view is definitely under the could do better category.
Alison, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, one of the things that actually Paul Stebbing raised in the chat that I thought was really relevant is that if we look at the map at the spread of invasive species, then and a big concern is that as climate's changing, we're going to have that's going to continue to accelerate. And then we've also got the issue that habitats are now exposed to multiple stresses. So we've got the climate change, and with that, the changes to flood dynamics, the changes to temperatures itself, and then add invasive species into that. Our ecosystems may be less resilient even than we're used to as well. So I think that it is an accelerating problem as well. And that sort of follows on from what Max was saying about being able to respond to things rapidly.
Tom, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
No, nothing from
Okay.
Jason.
All right, thanks.
Jason, could I just add something very briefly? I think that is a very key part to this. And Alison, so would you just listen to what you're saying, Alison? I think it sort of underlines it. We really have to get better at risk assessment as well. And maybe it isn't even risk assessment; it's a species assessment. Is this species actually going to be potentially of value? There are hundreds and hundreds of non-native species out there in our environment that are really quite important to us. So when new species arrive, we really ought to be able to make a decision, an educated decision. Should we do something about this, or okay, in terms of the pattern of habitat ecosystem development, is it one we can leave and watch and so on? We need to be more intelligent in our response rather than jumping at everyone as though it's a bad thing. And Alison's quite right. We've got to be more approach it in a more ecological way.
Thanks. So we need to move on, but a quick question for Jean on this. And apologies if I'm putting you on the spot here. Are there any species that there's an argument for us to let go, to say they're filling a new niche or an existing niche that's perhaps been left by something else?
I suppose, yeah, I'm not an expert on this. One thing that, and it's not yet in Ireland, but it's one that I've wondered about whether it would be good to have is beaver. That is never, and I know there's a big debate about that in the UK at the moment in terms of rewilding, and that, you know, was a species that was there. And it never actually was, you know, never made it over to Ireland. But I think that, you know, potentially that could serve a purpose, you know, in terms of natural flood management. And, you know, and if it were to be accidentally introduced and then to have, you know, a big, because they do obviously have a big impact on the environment, but whether that's, you know, negative or positive, you know, for a landowner, that's negative for, but for, you know, in terms of flood management, natural flood management, that might be positive. So it's just something that I have been thinking about, because there are a few, I mean, I suppose there's a few species that we have in Ireland, like clematis, you know, the traveller's joy, that is, you know, native in the UK, but not native in Ireland. And it is kind of, you know, it is invading, I suppose, a lot of our woodlands, but I think it kind of forms a nice component of a woodland. It does kind of like block out the light, but, you know, it does, in another way to look at it, I suppose, maybe is that it is forming another component. So I think a lot of these things are, you know, I think we can't deny that we have our own sort of personal feelings about it. We try to be as objective as possible, but yeah, I think these are difficult kind of questions, you know, so yeah, sorry,
Thanks.
Rambled on a bit
great.
there.
Thanks. Moving on, because we are running out of time. Max, one for you. I was going to ask you about technology. You brought that up in your article and how there's potential benefits in that, but there's another one that's come up in the chat as well around eDNA for monitoring and whether that would be useful. So one is do you think eDNA could form part of a monitoring program for invasives? And then were there other technological advances that you had in mind in your article?
Yeah, sure. And yeah, eDNA, water sampling, and then following it with eDNA analysis is actually being quite widely used now, particularly in the freshwater environment. A range of species can now be identified from their eDNA. And that's great. We need to continue to learn more about how to use that tool. Is it the same throughout the year? How many samples do we need to take? It's bound to be different for different species. I can't believe that it would all be exactly the same. So there are a number of variables and a degree of complexity as usual that we need to grapple with. That's interesting and exciting, and I'm sure that will develop, and also we'll be able to sort of pick up more in terms of terrestrial species as well. Other tools that we can use range from the use of drones, particularly, I'm thinking particularly of plants, and perhaps examples of where they've been used well already are species like giant hogweed, the larger, more obvious species. But as technology increases, we could find that we're able to use drones much more effectively for other species in certain habitats that are difficult to get to. Piece of work we undertook with a drone that you can actually land on the water and the lens pokes underneath, and we did some work on New Zealand pygmy crassula, and it's sort of much more efficient than paddling around in a boat, coping with the wind and oars and all the rest of it. Other intriguing developments, I met a dog the other day that can detect Japanese knotweed and is used for undertaking Japanese knotweed surveys. Well, why not lots of other species as well? So yeah, quite a lot going on in the new technologies area.
Would anyone like to add to that from the panel on new technology?
Yeah, just on the drone side of things. Yeah, I think that's a huge area of application for invasive plants. The technology and the software that's developing around that is impressive, and you can cover such large areas with a little bit of kind of ground truthing to validate those results. But yeah, I think drone technology is here to stay and will only improve. And I can see us, doing large scale investigations and identifying distribution. So yeah, I think that's definitely in the future. It sounds pretty exciting stuff. But yeah, and eDNA I think is coming on leaps and bounds and we'll start seeing that become a mainstay for the ecologists, as a kind of potentially maybe as a risk-based approach as well to early investigation to inform future management, future surveys. But yeah, it is a growing field and an exciting one.
Jean or Alison?
Yeah, just to.
Sorry, Max. Could we just let Alison have a?
Oh, sorry,
Yeah,
Alison.
sorry.
No, sorry. I wasn't going to say very much. Just that I thought I think the eDNA has definitely got it's definitely gaining legs, and of course it will also be very useful for detecting some of the things we can't see, the pathogenic organisms, the microorganisms, etc., that are like to be included in the strategy in the future.
So that's a really interesting point. I was going to give us, we've got 3 minutes left. That one question I was going to pick out was that one around, what are the panel's views on pathogenic non-native organisms being included under the GB invasive non-native species strategy? Well,
as I've got the microphone, I think it's an excellent idea, because I think we've got excellent legislation and guidance and strategies around our INS and around diseases of humans and managed animals, but there's a bit of a gap there for diseases of wildlife, and I think it's a great opportunity to include it there.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. I think it's the microorganisms that we don't see that can have some of the such significant effects and impacts. So yeah, I think it's only logical that we move to that kind of including that in our non-native species strategies.
Jean?
Yes, it's a good point. Yeah, and to be honest, I'm not sure what the legislation is in Ireland regarding the pathogens. Yeah, I'd have to look that up, but it's definitely a good point that there might be a bit of a gap there in what we're looking at.
Right. Max, a final word before I wrap up?
Which I think it just underlines the overall challenge of the diversity of invasive species, that we are somewhat sort of influenced by the human nature, if you like, and we need to have a broader view, as I've indicated in the work that we do as consultant ecologists today. As for tomorrow, absolutely, we need to understand much more about pathogenic microorganisms and so on. There's an awful lot of work to do to get there, but we need to. The last 18 months has underlined for sure that we need to know more about these things, where they come from, and how we can prevent getting ourselves in a mess.
Great, thanks very much. I think we'll have to wrap it up there. It's literally just turned over to 1 o'clock on my clock. So apologies we didn't get to all the questions from the audience, but thank you for putting those in. It's really great to have that engagement. So just to say that this episode has been recorded. We'll put this on YouTube and on our resource hub, so it will be available hopefully later in the week. As I said earlier, the next episode of Sector Streams will be on environmental net gain, so that'll be in late August. Keep an eye on e-news, social media, and the website for that. We will advertise it when we have the details finalized. And then lastly, just to say thank you very much to the panel for giving up their time today to come and talk to us, and thank you to all the listeners for joining us as well. Thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Jason.
Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers.